She walked straight toward the horse that had put 3 grown men in the hospital. No rope, no crop, no saddle. Just a widow in a black dress, moving through the mud like she had somewhere to be. And nobody could stop her. The ranch hands pressed themselves against the fence. One of them was already dialing 911. And then she stopped, right in front of him. The horse went completely still, and she started to cry. Before we get into what happened out there in that field, I need to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone do something so quietly brave that it actually hurt to look at? That's what this story is. It's about a woman named Lena, a horse nobody could touch, and a piece of grief so heavy it had nowhere to go, until it finally found the right place to land. If you've ever lost someone and felt like part of you got buried with them, stay with me. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe if you're new, because this one is going to stay with you. Now, let me tell you what really happened at Redbone Creek. The town of Millhaven, Tennessee sits in a valley so green in spring it almost looks painted. The kind of place where everybody knows your name, your business, your truck, and your heartache. Population just under 4,000. 1 stoplight, 2 churches. A diner called Patsy's, where the coffee is terrible and the gossip is legendary. On the eastern edge of town, past the Callaway Bridge and the old grain mill, there's a property called Redbone Creek Ranch. It had been in the Hartley family for 3 generations. Tobacco first, then cattle, then eventually horses. Quarter horses mostly, bred for barrel racing and trail work. Solid working animals with honest temperaments. But in the spring of the year this story takes place, there was one horse at Redbone Creek that didn't belong in either of those categories. His name was Cinder. Cinder was a 6-year-old black stallion, 16.2 hands tall, with a white blaze down his face and eyes the color of dark amber. He had been purchased at auction 18 months earlier by Hartley family patriarch Wyatt Hartley, a square-jawed, slow-talking man of 62 who had spent his whole life reading horses and prided himself on never meeting one he couldn't understand. Cinder humbled him immediately. Nobody could agree on what had made the horse this way. The auction house records were clean. The vet who'd cleared him before purchase found no neurological issues. But from the first week, Cinder was different. Not wild in the playful, untrained sense, but dangerous in a way that felt almost intentional. He didn't spook, he attacked. He had charged ranch hand Bo twice in the first month. He had put the farrier through a fence. He had broken the wrist of Wyatt's most experienced trainer, a man named Dolph, who had gentled horses professionally for 27 years, and said, quietly, on the way to the emergency room, "That horse knows exactly what he's doing." By autumn, Cinder lived alone in the back pasture. Nobody went in. They fed him through the rails. The official plan, Wyatt had told his wife Norma, was to give him 1 more season. If nothing changed, they'd call a specialist. If the specialist couldn't help, well, nobody finished that sentence out loud. And then Wyatt Hartley died in November. It wasn't dramatic. He had a heart attack in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the table with his reading glasses on and a cup of coffee going cold. Norma found him when she came downstairs. The paramedics were kind. The funeral was full. The whole town turned out, the way small towns do, when a man who meant something is gone. After that, Norma Hartley was alone at Redbone Creek. She was 58 years old, small-framed, quiet in a way people sometimes mistook for frailty. She had a daughter, Josephine, who lived in Nashville and called every evening. She had neighbors who left casseroles on the porch. She had a ranch manager named Sid, who kept the operation running and checked on her every morning. She had grief so enormous it seemed to have its own atmosphere. You could feel it when you stood near her. What Norma also had, though nobody fully appreciated it yet, was 40 years of watching her husband with horses. She had never trained one herself, had never claimed to, but she had stood at more fence rails than she could count, watching Wyatt work, watching him listen. She had heard him explain, more times than she could remember, that the horses nobody could reach weren't bad horses. They were scared horses, or worse, they were horses that had been hurt. The trouble with Cinder hadn't changed since Wyatt died. If anything, the back pasture felt darker. Sid had started talking to Norma about options, the specialist option, the other option. He was gentle about it, but he was practical. A dangerous horse on a working ranch was a liability, and Wyatt wasn't here anymore to hold out hope. Norma listened to all of it. She nodded in the right places. And on the third Saturday after the funeral, on a grey February morning when the frost was still on the ground and Josephine was still asleep in the guest room, Norma put on her black coat and walked out to the back pasture alone. Sid saw her from the barn and went white. He ran. He didn't make it in time. Sid Pruitt had worked at Redbone Creek for 11 years. He was 44, built like someone who had spent those 11 years doing physical labor, slow to alarm and hard to rattle. He had seen things on that ranch that would make a city person's eyes go wide. He had helped deliver foals at 2 in the morning in freezing rain. He had euthanized animals and felt it for days. He was not a man who panicked easily. When he looked out of the barn that morning and saw Norma Hartley walking across the frost-covered grass toward Cinder's pasture, he felt something he would later describe to his wife as cold water running straight through his chest. He shouted her name. She either didn't hear him or didn't stop. He ran. Bo Calloway, no relation to the bridge, it was just a name, was 23, the youngest hand on the property. He was patching a section of fence near the south gate when he heard Sid shout. He looked up and saw Norma. Then he saw where she was headed. He dropped his tools and started running too. Neither of them made it before she reached the gate. What happened next would be replayed in that town for years. Both men would describe it many times, at Patsy's diner, at their own kitchen tables, to anyone who asked. They would describe it slowly, carefully, like people trying to honor something they didn't fully understand. Norma reached the gate to the back pasture and unlatched it. She didn't take a lead rope from the post. She didn't take the crop that hung there. She didn't have a bucket of feed, a halter, nothing. She just opened the gate and walked through it, pulling it closed behind her, not latching it, just closing it. Cinder was at the far end of the pasture, standing near the tree line. He saw her immediately. Both men, watching from 20 yards away, pressing against the outside of the fence, saw the horse's head come up, saw his body shift, saw the particular kind of attention that, in this horse, had always preceded a charge. Bo grabbed his phone. He made the call. He would say later, explaining himself to the dispatcher, "I didn't know what else to do. I was watching her die." But Norma kept walking. She walked slowly, not with the wide-open, non-threatening body language that trainers used. Arms out, sideways approach, all that. She walked like a woman walking somewhere, like she had a purpose and the horse was part of it, but not the obstacle. Cinder moved. Both men stopped breathing. The horse came off the tree line at a trot, closing the distance fast, neck arched, nostrils flared wide. Sid grabbed the gate latch. He was going to go in. He knew, they both knew, that Cinder at a trot could become Cinder at a charge in under 2 seconds. And then the horse stopped. He stopped maybe 15 feet from Norma, and both men would later struggle to describe what happened to his body in that moment. Sid would say he deflated. Bo would say he cracked. What they both agreed on was that something went out of the horse, something hard and braced and defended, and what replaced it looked almost exactly like exhaustion. Norma stopped walking. She stood still, looking at him. Not at his eyes. She wasn't trying to dominate him, wasn't holding his gaze with the firm intention of a trainer establishing authority. She was just looking at him, the way you look at something that's hurting. The horse took one step toward her, then another. And then Norma Hartley, widow of Wyatt Hartley, 58 years old, 3 weeks out from the worst day of her life, reached up and put her hand on the face of the horse that had put 3 men in the hospital, and she stood there, with her forehead almost touching his, and she cried. Not quietly. The men outside the fence could hear her. Cinder didn't move. He stood with his head lowered, his breathing slowing, and he let her. Sid would later say that he stood there for probably 5 minutes before he could make himself move. Bo had already sat down in the grass, which he would not admit to anyone except his mother. The dispatcher on Bo's phone eventually hung up, which he didn't notice. When Norma finally pulled her hand back, Cinder followed it. Just a small movement, like he wasn't ready for the contact to end. Norma looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned, walked back to the gate, let herself out, and latched it behind her. She walked past Sid without saying anything. He turned and watched her go. Tried to find something to say, couldn't. It was Bo who eventually spoke, still sitting in the frost, watching Cinder standing at the gate now, watching Norma's back. "What was that?" he said. Sid didn't have an answer. He didn't have one for weeks. Josephine Hartley was 31, a landscape architect in Nashville, practical and precise and, like her mother, easy to underestimate. She had come home for the funeral and stayed through February, unable to make herself leave yet. She slept in her childhood room. She ate her mother's cooking. She helped with the ranch books. She called her mother's grief a presence in the house, something that occupied the rooms alongside them. She had been watching her mother since the funeral with the particular alertness of someone who is scared for a person and trying not to show it. What happened in the back pasture frightened her. Not because she thought Cinder would have hurt her mother. She had seen what happened with her own eyes, had watched from the kitchen window when she heard Sid shouting. She'd watched the whole thing, frozen at the glass, and she had felt the same thing Sid felt, that cold water sensation, and she had watched the horse lower his head, and she had exhaled so hard she fogged the window. What frightened her was what it meant about her mother, the deliberateness of it. Norma Hartley was not a reckless woman. She had not wandered into that pasture by accident or in a confused haze of grief. She had made a decision. That evening after dinner, Josephine asked her about it. Norma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I needed to go somewhere that was just as bad as I felt." Josephine didn't know what to do with that. She turned it over for days. Meanwhile, the story was spreading through Millhaven with the speed that only small-town stories achieve. By Monday, half the people at Patsy's had heard a version of it. By Wednesday, the versions had diversified. In some of them, Cinder had charged and Norma had stood her ground. In others, the horse had knelt. He had not knelt. In one remarkable retelling, there had been a rainbow. But the core of it was consistent. The widow walked into the pasture with the most dangerous horse in the county and came out unharmed. People had opinions. Some of them were gentle. A grieving woman finding comfort in an animal, something beautiful and healing. Some of them were less gentle, a woman in shock, not thinking clearly, who had gotten lucky and shouldn't push it. The veterinarian who served the ranch, a compact and careful woman named Dr. Maren Good, had heard the story by Wednesday and drove out to the ranch on Thursday, nominally to check on a mare that had been off her feed, really to see Cinder and to see Norma. What Dr. Good told Norma that afternoon changed the shape of the story considerably. She had done some asking around, she said. After the auction, after Cinder had been purchased and his behavioral issues had become apparent, she had started making calls to the auction house, to the breeder, to the previous owner. She had never gotten complete information. There were gaps, evasions, the kind of strategic vagueness that happens when people know something didn't reflect well on them. But she had gotten enough. Cinder's previous owner had been a man named Rowan Stellers, a small-time operation in eastern Kentucky. What Dr. Good had pieced together, from conversations with a former employee of Stellers and from a report filed with the State Agriculture Board, was this. For at least a year before the auction, Cinder had been subjected to training methods that are politely called aggressive and more accurately called cruel, punishment-based, pain-based. Methods designed not to teach the horse but to break him. They hadn't broken Cinder. They had made him into a wall. Every time a human being approached him with confidence, with purpose, with the body language of someone who intended to handle him, he read it as a threat, because for a year it had been. He had learned that people who moved like they had authority hurt him. He had learned to get there first. What Norma had done walking toward him not as a trainer, not as someone with authority or an agenda, but as someone in pain, someone not performing competence, someone who was, in every visible way, as broken as he was the one thing he didn't have a defense for. He hadn't recognized her as a threat. He had recognized her as something else. Dr. Good said it carefully, aware she was talking to a grieving woman about her own grief. He may have recognized something familiar. Norma sat with that for a long time. Then she said, Wyatt always said the ones nobody could reach were the ones who had been let down the most. Dr. Good drove home and sat in her truck in her own driveway for a while. She had been doing this work for 20 years. She had seen a lot. She wasn't sure she had seen anything quite like Norma Hartley. She went back the next morning. Sid saw her coming from the barn and walked out to meet her. He wasn't going to stop her. He had already decided that, but he was going to be there. This time she had brought something, a handful of dried apple slices she'd cut the night before, kept in her coat pocket. She didn't treat them like a tool. She wasn't using them to lure or to condition. She just had them because Wyatt had always said, "You bring something when you visit." She opened the gate, walked in, closed it behind her. Cinder was already watching her from the middle of the pasture. His posture was different today. Still alert, still carrying the tension she now understood was structural in him, built into his muscles by a year of waiting for pain. But he wasn't at the tree line. He hadn't retreated. He was standing out in the open, watching her come. She stopped about 10 feet away. She didn't reach for the apple. She just stood there in the cold morning air, with her hands in her pockets, looking at him. Cinder's ears moved, forward, back, forward, reading her. Sid, watching from outside the fence, could see the horse's nostrils working, processing her scent, that same scent from yesterday, cataloging the information. Same person. No pain yesterday. What about today? The wait was almost 4 minutes by Sid's count. Then Cinder walked to her, not tentative, not creeping the way a mistreated animal sometimes approaches, low and apologetic. He walked to her like he was making a decision, stopped close enough that Norma could have reached out and touched his face without fully extending her arm, looked at her. She took out an apple slice and held it in her flat palm. He took it, then another. He nuzzled her palm when they were gone, checking. She laughed. It was a small sound, a surprise sound, and Sid, who had known this woman for 11 years, who had worked her land and fixed her fences and eaten at her table, said later that it was the first time he had heard that sound since Wyatt died, and it did something to him he couldn't explain, went through him like a key turning. She put her hand on Cinder's neck. He didn't move. She ran her palms slowly up to his jaw, to his cheek, to his forehead. He dropped his head slightly, the horse equivalent of leaning into something. Sid sat down on an overturned bucket and looked at his boots for a while. This became the pattern. Every morning, Norma went out. She never varied the time much. Cinder was already at the middle of the pasture by the time she arrived, a fact that did not escape her. She never pushed the encounters further than he was ready for. No lead rope, no halter, no agenda, except to be there. She started talking to him. Not training talk, not commands, just talking. She talked about Wyatt, about the early years of their marriage, about the ranch when it was struggling, about the trips they'd taken, about small things she missed that she hadn't told anyone else because they were too specific to explain. How he folded the newspaper, the particular way he said her name when he was about to ask her something, the sound of his truck on the gravel at evening. She didn't know if the horse understood any of it. That wasn't the point. Josephine started watching from the kitchen window every morning, coffee cup in both hands, not wanting to leave for Nashville until she had seen it, and then not being able to make herself leave even after. She called her friend Tilda in Nashville one morning after watching and said, "I think my mother is healing herself." Tilda asked what she meant. Josephine watched her mother put her forehead against Cinder's forehead, both of them still in the morning cold. "I'm not sure I can explain it," she said, "but she found the one thing on this property as hurt as she is, and she's just being with it, without trying to fix it. and I think that might be the only thing that was ever going to fix either of them. By the end of the third week, Cinder was meeting her at the gate. Sid reported this to Dr. Good on a Thursday afternoon, in a voice that communicated rather a lot of emotion for a man who talked the way Sid talked. Dr. Good said she'd come by on Saturday. Word travels at its own pace in a small town, and by March, the story of Norma Hartley and the Black Stallion was not a rumor anymore. It was a fact that people treated with something between admiration and reverence, the particular kind of respect a community gives to something it witnessed and doesn't fully understand. People at Patsy's Diner talked about it. The waitress, a sharp-eyed young woman named Retta, had her own theory, which she delivered to anyone who had coffee long enough to hear it. Grief does something to people, takes away the part that's performing, and animals, they don't respond to your performance. They respond to what's real. She was the most real she'd ever been. Whether Retta was right, or whether she was just good at morning shift philosophy, the observation circulated. The pastor of Millhaven's larger church, a thoughtful man named Reverend Gale, mentioned it obliquely in a Sunday sermon about being present in darkness. He didn't name Norma. He didn't need to. Half his congregation knew exactly what he was referring to. Norma herself was not performing anything for Millhaven. She was barely aware of the attention. She got up every morning, put on her coat, and went to the back pasture. That was the center of her day. The rest, the casseroles, the cards, the gentle inquiries, moved around her like water around a stone. But the story was growing, and eventually it attracted the attention of someone who would complicate it considerably. His name was Aldrich Foss, and he was 47 from Louisville, a horse trainer with a regional reputation, not famous, but known. He had a YouTube channel with 60,000 subscribers, where he documented his work with difficult horses, and he drove a truck with his name on the side of it. He had heard the Millhaven story through a contact and arrived at Redbone Creek on a Tuesday in early March, uninvited, with what he described as professional curiosity and what Sid immediately identified as something closer to competitive interest. Foss was not a bad man. He was skilled, genuinely skilled, and his methods were humane. But he was a man who believed that what he did was a discipline, a craft that took years to build, and the idea that a grieving woman with no training background had accomplished in a handful of mornings what he might have spent months working toward, that sat sideways with him. He talked to Norma for 20 minutes at the kitchen table. Josephine sat in the corner and listened. He was respectful. He asked careful questions. He explained gently that what Norma had experienced was likely a moment of lucky timing. Cinder was at a point in his stress cycle where he might have been receptive to any low-threat approach, and it was important not to read too much meaning into it. He offered his services. He said he could work with Cinder properly, build a real foundation, make the horse safe. Norma listened to all of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you. I appreciate you driving out." He waited for more. "Cinder doesn't need a foundation," she said quietly. "He needs someone to keep showing up. I'm doing that." Foss left. Josephine watched his truck go down the drive and felt something she recognized as pride, which surprised her with its intensity. She called Tilda again that night. "Mom just sent a professional horse trainer home," she said. Tilda said, "What did she say?" Josephine told her. There was a pause. "Your mom," Tilda said finally, "is kind of terrifying." "I know," Josephine said. "I'm starting to think she always was, and we just weren't paying attention." There was someone else paying attention, though. Someone in Millhaven who had been watching from a different angle entirely, and whose involvement would change the rest of the story in ways nobody expected. Her name was Calla Briggs. She was 71, retired, and she had known Wyatt Hartley for 40 years. More to the point, she had known horses her entire life, had grown up on a working ranch in western Tennessee, and had spent 10 years before her retirement as a volunteer with a therapeutic riding program in Knoxville. She had seen what horses could do for people in pain. She had also seen in her time what a person in genuine, unguarded grief could do for a horse. She came to Redbone Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, not to offer services or expertise, but to tell Norma something. She told her about the therapeutic program, about a facility in the next county that worked with veterans, with teenagers aging out of foster care, with people recovering from trauma, about horses that had come to that program as difficult animals, some of them with histories not unlike Cinder's, and what had happened to those horses when they were given the right kind of patient, undemanding presence. She told Norma that what she was doing had a name, and that people trained for years to do it with exactly the instinctive accuracy that Norma had found through grief. Norma listened to all of this. Then she looked out the kitchen window toward the back pasture. "He's not ready to help anybody else yet," she said. "No," Calla agreed, "but you might be building toward it without knowing it." That sentence lived in Norma Hartley for a long time. The last week of March brought a storm system that moved through Middle Tennessee with the kind of aggression that makes local weathermen uncharacteristically dramatic. Wind gusts over 50 miles an hour, hail, flash flood warnings for the lowland properties. At Redbone Creek, which sat in the valley below the Callaway Ridge, the creek for which the ranch was named came up fast. Not flood fast, but fast enough to swallow the lower fence line and put 6 inches of water through the equipment shed. They lost power at 2 in the morning. Sid had come out when the storm intensified, sleeping in his truck in the barn lot rather than driving home. Bo had come too. The horses in the main barn were restless, but contained. The fence check at dawn showed 3 sections down in the northeast pasture. Manageable. The back pasture fence was intact, but Cinder was not in the back pasture. The gate, the same gate Norma used every morning, that she closed but never latched behind her, a habit nobody had corrected because the horse never approached it, had blown open in the night. The storm, the noise, the lightning, any one of them enough to send a traumatized horse through an open gate. Sid found the open gate at 6:15. He stood there for a moment, then he went to the house. He knocked instead of calling. He didn't want Norma to hear this over the phone. She came to the door in her robe, already awake. The storm had kept her up too. He told her, watched her face go through something complicated and quiet. She looked past him at the gray, wet morning. "Which direction?" she said. Sid didn't know. He hadn't found tracks yet. The rain had been heavy enough to obscure them. "I'll find him," Norma said. "Norma, I'll find him." She got dressed while Sid woke Bo. The 3 of them split the property. Bo took the south fence. Sid went toward the creek. Norma went east toward the woods that bordered the Callaway property. Josephine, awake now too, stood on the porch until her mother disappeared into the tree line, then went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and didn't pretend to do anything useful. The woods east of the ranch were not extensive, maybe 40 acres before they opened back up into Callaway's hayfields. Wet now, branches down from the wind, the ground soft. Norma moved through them carefully, calling Cinder's name. She was aware that this was, objectively, the scenario everyone had worried about from the beginning. A loose, traumatized stallion, frightened by a storm, with no lead rope and no backup, and a woman who had 0 formal training attempting a retrieval. She was also aware that she was not afraid. She couldn't fully explain this to herself. She was cold and wet and worried. She was worried for him, specifically in the particular way you worry about something that has allowed itself to be vulnerable with you and that you cannot bear to fail. But fear? No. Whatever had left her on the morning she walked into that pasture in February, whatever part of her had been too worn down by loss to calculate risk the way she used to, it hadn't come back yet. Maybe it wouldn't. She found him at the eastern edge of the woods, at the boundary where the trees gave way to the open hayfield. He was standing at the tree line, facing the field, not grazing, just standing, wet and shivering slightly in the cold air, looking out at the open space like he was trying to decide something. He heard her before she came fully out of the trees. His head came around. She stopped. They looked at each other. She said his name, once, quietly. The way you say the name of something you are relieved to see. Cinder's ears went forward, his body tense, braced, the body of an animal that had spent a frightening night alone in the cold. She watched something shift in it, not all the way to ease, but toward her. She walked out of the trees and came toward him, not slow and deliberate this time, just normally, the way she'd walk toward anyone she was glad to find. He watched her come and didn't move. She reached him, put her hand on his neck, felt him shivering, put both arms around his neck and pressed her face against him. He stood absolutely still. "I found you," she said, into the wet hair of his neck, and she was not only talking to the horse. She stood like that for a few minutes, then she stepped back, checked him over, no injuries, no obvious distress beyond cold and the residue of a frightening night. She took off her outer coat, which was waterproof and would do him no particular good, but was something to put her hands on. She looped it loosely around his neck. Not a lead, just weight, just the suggestion of connection. She started walking back toward the ranch. He followed her. He followed her through 40 acres of woods, through the wet underbrush, along the fence, all the way back to the open gate of the back pasture. She walked him in. He went through the gate without hesitation, turned, and stood looking at her while she closed it behind her, latching it this time, definitively. Bo was the first one back. He saw them at the gate and stopped walking, stood in the middle of the yard with mud on his boots and just looked. Sid came from the creekside 10 minutes later. He saw Bo standing there, followed his gaze. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Did you walk him back?" "Yes," Norma said. "With what?" "My coat." Sid looked at the coat looped around the stallion's neck. Cinder was eating now, unbothered, the gate between him and the world and Norma standing on the outside of it. "That's not a lead," Sid said. "I know," Norma said. He looked at her. "He just followed." "Yes." Sid turned back toward the barn. He stopped halfway and said without turning around, "Wyatt would have loved this." Norma looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I was thinking that the whole time." Josephine was in the kitchen doorway. She had seen them come out of the tree line from the window, her mother first, and then, behind her, a black horse moving through the wet morning like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. She had put both hands over her mouth. She had not been able to move for several minutes. When her mother came inside, Josephine hugged her so hard and for so long that Norma eventually laughed a little and said, "Joe, I need to take my boots off." Josephine stepped back, looked at her. "You're soaking wet." "I know. You found him. He was at the tree line. He was just waiting." Josephine thought about that, like he knew you'd come. Norma pulled off her boots, one and then the other, set them by the door. "I think maybe," she said. "We both knew." Spring came to Redbone Creek the way it always does in that valley. Slowly, and then all at once. The creek went back inside its banks. The lower fence line was repaired. The equipment shed dried out and was reorganized, which was something Wyatt had been meaning to do for 2 years. Cinder began to change. It was not a dramatic transformation of the movie moment variety. It was slow and incremental and sometimes frustrating because healing is. Some mornings he was easy, and some mornings he was wary, and some mornings something in the air, or the light or the sound of something in the distance made him tense and hard to reach. Those mornings, Norma didn't push. She came. She stood nearby. She let him know she was still there. Sid started coming into the back pasture with her in April. He stood at the fence first, then inside the gate, then gradually nearer, following Norma's lead, literally watching her body language and matching it, letting her dictate the approach. Cinder tolerated him within a few weeks. Bo took longer. Cinder remembered Bo, probably. Bo had been one of the hands he'd charged in the early months, but by May, Bo could move through the pasture without incident, and by June, he could put a hand on Cinder's neck. Dr. Good came out regularly. She documented everything with the precision of someone who understood that this was not a common situation and that the record mattered. She began consulting with a colleague at an equine behavioral research program at UT, a woman named Dr. Petra Ames, who drove to Redbone Creek in April, watched a morning session with her mouth slightly open and asked Norma if she would be willing to be interviewed. Norma said she'd think about it. Calla Briggs came back in May, as she'd said she would. She and Norma sat on the back porch for 2 hours. Norma asked her questions about the therapeutic program, real questions, practical questions, the kind of questions that mean someone is not just being polite. What did it take to get a horse certified? What were the requirements for the facility? What kind of timeline were they talking about? Calla answered all of it. "This is at least a year away," Norma said at the end. "Maybe more." "Yes," Calla said. Norma looked toward the back pasture. "He'll be ready," she said. "I'm not sure yet if I will." Calla put her hand over Norma's on the porch rail. "I think," she said, "that's the most honest thing I've heard anyone say in a long time." Josephine went back to Nashville in April. It was hard, harder than she'd expected, leaving the ranch, leaving her mother, leaving the strange and specific peace she had found in standing at that kitchen window every morning with her coffee. She cried in the car for the first hour. Then she stopped and called her mother. Norma answered on the second ring. "I'm fine," she said, before Josephine could speak. "I know," Josephine said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." "Joe?" "Yeah. He was at the gate when I went out this morning." Josephine held the phone. "He's always at the gate now," Norma said. "Every single morning." The following October, 14 months after Wyatt Hartley died at his kitchen table with his reading glasses on, there was a small ceremony at Redbone Creek Ranch. It wasn't formal. There was no press, no fanfare. Calla Briggs was there, and Dr. Good, and Dr. Petra Ames, and Sid, and Bo and Josephine, who had driven from Nashville the night before, a handful of neighbors, the pastor, Reverend Gale, who came not in any official capacity, but simply because he'd heard there was something worth witnessing. Norma Hartley, in an open field behind the barn, saddled a horse for the first time in her life. She had been learning since May. Quietly, the way she did everything, methodically in the early mornings, with Calla's patient guidance and Cinder's patient cooperation. She was not a natural rider. She had no illusion about that. Her form was imperfect and would probably remain so, but that was not what the morning was about. She mounted. Cinder stood still beneath her, ears forward, waiting. She walked him across the field, just a walk, nothing more. The same field where Sid had once looked out and seen a woman he thought was about to die. The same ground where Bo had sat down in the frost. The same October light coming through the same Tennessee sky. Nobody said much. When she came around and brought him to a stop near the fence where everyone was standing, she sat for a moment looking at nothing in particular. Then she patted his neck, slowly, and dismounted. Sid was looking at the ground again. Josephine was not bothering to pretend she wasn't crying. Norma handed the reins to Calla, turned to the small group, and said the only thing she'd prepared to say. "Wyatt always told me that the horse nobody can reach is just the horse waiting for the right person. He said it about horses, but I think he was saying it about everything." She paused. "I spent 14 months trying to figure out how to go on without him. I didn't figure it out. I just kept going out in the morning. And eventually, morning by morning, something started to come together. Not because I was brave, not because I knew what I was doing, but because I kept showing up, and so did he." She looked at Cinder. "I don't know how to grieve correctly. I don't think there is a correct way, but I think the nearest thing to it might be this. You find the broken thing. You go to it every day. You don't ask it to be fixed yet. You just stay near it, and you let it stay near you." Reverend Gale would quote that, almost verbatim, in a sermon the following Sunday. He would not name Norma. He wouldn't need to. The therapeutic riding program at the facility in the next county formally accepted Cinder's application for evaluation in the spring of the following year. The evaluation took 3 months, which is standard. He passed. He passed, the evaluator noted in her report, with an unusual degree of responsiveness to anxious or distressed riders, as though some part of his own history had become, improbably, a form of fluency. Norma drove to the facility every Wednesday to work with him. She said, when Josephine asked what it was like, watching him with the program participants, "He's very gentle with people who are scared. I think he knows what that feels like." Josephine said, "Mom, that's you too." Norma thought about it. "Maybe," she said, "maybe we figured it out together." There's a version of this story where Norma Hartley is a hero, where we applaud the bravery, the skill, the instinct, where we make it into something clean and triumphant. I don't think that's quite right. What Norma did wasn't brave in the way we usually mean that word. Calculated courage, chosen in the full knowledge of risk. She walked into that pasture because she was broken open, and her brokenness was the only thing Cinder recognized as safe. She healed him, in part, because she wasn't pretending to be okay. There's something in that worth sitting with. How many of us are performing okayness when the truest, most connective thing we could offer is just the honest weight of where we actually are? Cinder didn't need Norma to be strong. He needed her to be real, and she was. Wyatt Hartley said it about horses. But maybe it was always about everything. The thing nobody can reach is waiting for the right person. The right person might not be the strongest, the most trained, the most prepared. It might be the most present, the most willing to stay. Morning by morning, that's it. That's the whole story. If it moved you, if you thought of someone while you were listening, leave their name in the comments. Or just leave where you're watching from. Those comments mean more than you know. They're the reason this channel exists. Like this video. Subscribe if you haven't. Share it with someone who's been having a hard season, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. And if you can't quite manage that today, find the thing that's as broken as you are and just stay near it. Sometimes that's enough to begin.